There was a killer in California. For years, he moved through quiet neighborhoods, watching homes, studying routines, and waiting for the right moment. He was not a stranger lurking in some abandoned alley. He could have been driving past your house. He could have been standing in a grocery store behind you. He could have been someone nobody thought to fear. Between the 1970s and 1980s, a predator terrorized communities across California. He broke into homes at night, attacked women and men, committed murders, and disappeared before investigators could catch him. Police gave him different names over the years. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. Eventually, the world would know him by another name, the Golden State Killer. But for nearly 40 years, nobody knew who he really was. And the most shocking part of the investigation wasn't simply how long he remained unidentified. It was how close the truth had been hiding all along. The first attack began in California in the mid-1970s. At first, investigators struggled to understand what they were dealing with. A woman would report that someone had entered her home. Another victim would describe a masked intruder. Then another. The attacks seemed random. But investigators slowly began noticing something disturbing. They weren't random at all. The attacker appeared to study his victims before striking. He watched neighborhoods. He learned people's schedules. He learned which houses were occupied. And he seemed to understand exactly how to enter without being noticed. Then came the detail that terrified investigators most. The attacker wasn't simply breaking into homes. He was controlling the people inside them. Victims described a masked man entering their bedrooms in the darkness, sometimes using a flashlight or weapon to awaken them. He would issue commands. He would threaten them. And he would make them believe that one wrong movement could cost them their lives. The psychological terror was almost as devastating as the physical violence. Some victims survived. Others would never get the chance. And every time police arrived after an attack, the same question remained. Where was he? As the attacks continued, law enforcement began seeing patterns. The attacker appeared to be learning. He became more cautious. He changed his methods. He seemed to understand police procedures and how investigators might track him. That made the case even more frightening. This wasn't simply someone committing crimes impulsively. He appeared to be adapting. Meanwhile, California communities were becoming increasingly afraid. People checked their doors repeatedly. Windows were locked. Neighbors warned one another. Parents worried about their children. And people who had never met their attacker began changing the way they lived their lives because of him. But the killer kept moving. And every time authorities thought they were getting closer, he disappeared again. Then something changed. The crimes associated with the East Area Rapist eventually appeared to stop. For years, investigators wondered whether the offender had died, been imprisoned for another crime, moved away, or simply stopped. But the nightmare wasn't over. It had changed locations. In Southern California, a series of murders began drawing attention. Investigators believed the crimes were connected. The killer now appeared to be targeting couples. The attacks were brutal, and investigators began seeing similarities to the earlier crimes. The same disturbing patterns, the same calculated behavior, the same sense that the offender was watching his victims before striking. The name Original Night Stalker began appearing. But investigators didn't immediately know that the man behind these murders was connected to the earlier attacks. For years, the cases were treated as separate investigations. Different regions, different detectives, different victims, different names. But somewhere beneath the surface was one terrifying possibility. What if they were hunting the same man? Eventually, the attack stopped, and the killer vanished. No dramatic arrest, no confession, no courtroom, no explanation, just silence. The case became one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Years became decades. Investigators retired. Evidence was stored. Files accumulated dust. Families continued living with questions that could never be answered. For the victims who survived, the memories didn't simply disappear because the attacker did. Some carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. And for families who had lost loved ones, there was another painful reality. The person responsible was still free, somewhere, living an ordinary life, possibly growing old, possibly raising a family. possibly walking through the same communities as everyone else, and investigators had no idea who he was. Then technology changed everything. Investigators had something incredibly valuable. DNA evidence. Biological evidence from some of the crime scenes had been preserved. The problem was that investigators didn't know whose DNA they were looking at. There was no name attached to it, no suspect, no match. The killer remained unidentified. But DNA doesn't forget, and as forensic technology improved, investigators were able to use genetic evidence in ways that detectives from the 1970s could never have imagined. The case was reopened with new determination. Investigators compared evidence. They revisited old reports. They examined connections between crimes. And they began asking a question that had haunted California for decades. Who was the man behind all of this? By this point, investigators had connected the attacks and murders across different parts of California. The different names began converging into one terrifying identity: the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Golden State Killer, one offender, dozens of attacks, multiple murders, and nearly 4 decades of freedom. But there was still one enormous problem. Investigators had DNA. They had crime scenes. They had victim accounts. They had mountains of evidence, but they still didn't have a name. Then investigators turned to a method that would change the case forever: genetic genealogy. Instead of searching only for a direct DNA match, investigators could potentially search genetic databases for relatives of the unknown suspect. They weren't necessarily looking for the killer himself. They were looking for his family, and that idea opened a door that had been closed for decades. Investigators reportedly found a genetic connection to a distant relative. It wasn't the killer, but it was a clue, a thread, and detectives began building a family tree. Generation by generation, branch by branch, they examined relatives. They eliminated people. They followed names. And eventually, investigators narrowed their attention toward one man. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo, an ordinary-looking former police officer living in California. For decades, nobody had publicly connected him to the terrifying crimes. That was the twist that stunned investigators. The man they were looking at wasn't some mysterious fugitive hiding in another country. He wasn't living under an elaborate disguise. He was living an ordinary life. A retired man, a grandfather, a former law enforcement officer. And investigators believed they had finally found the identity of the man they had been hunting for nearly 40 years. But they still needed proof. Investigators couldn't simply walk into court and say they had a suspicion. They needed evidence. So they watched DeAngelo. They collected discarded DNA. And eventually, investigators obtained genetic material believed to link him to the crimes. The evidence changed everything. After decades of uncertainty, investigators believed they finally had their suspect. On April 24th, 2018, Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights, California. The Golden State Killer investigation had reached the moment generations of investigators had been waiting for. The nightmare finally had a face. For many people, DeAngelo's arrest was almost impossible to comprehend. How could someone accused of committing such horrific crimes have spent decades living what appeared to be an ordinary life? Neighbors describe a man who did not resemble the terrifying image associated with the Golden State Killer. That contrast made the case even more disturbing. The killer wasn't hiding in a dark basement. He had been hiding in plain sight. And suddenly, old memories came rushing back. Investigators revisited decades-old evidence. Victims and families learned that the man who had haunted their lives finally had a name. For some survivors, the arrest brought relief. For others, it reopened wounds they had spent decades trying to live with. And for families who had lost loved ones, there was finally the possibility of accountability. In 2020, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to numerous charges connected to crimes. The courtroom became the setting for a reckoning that had taken decades to arrive. Victims and survivors confronted the man accused of destroying so many lives. Some spoke about fear. Some spoke about trauma. Some spoke about the years they had spent wondering whether justice would ever come. Their stories made one thing painfully clear. The case wasn't just about a killer. It was about the people who survived him, the families who lost loved ones, the communities that lived in fear, and the investigators who refused to let the case disappear completely. DeAngelo was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. After almost 40 years, the Golden State Killer was finally behind bars. The Golden State Killer investigation became more than the story of one criminal. It became a landmark example of how modern technology could transform cold case investigations. For decades, detectives had followed traditional investigative methods: interviews, fingerprints, witness statements, crime scene evidence, DNA, but none had been enough to identify the offender. Then genetic genealogy gave investigators something new, a way to move backward through a family tree until they reached the person they were looking for. It was a breakthrough, but it also created difficult questions about privacy, consent, and how genetic information could be used in criminal investigations. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated both the extraordinary power of modern forensic science and the complicated questions that come with it. Behind every statistic was a human being, a daughter, a son, a spouse, a parent, a friend. The crimes are often remembered because of the man who committed them, but the Rayall story belongs to the people whose lives were changed forever. Some victims survived attacks that could have ended their lives. Some families spent decades waiting for answers, and some never got the chance to see justice arrive. That is why the ending of this investigation wasn't simply an arrest. It was an acknowledgement. The victims had never been forgotten. Their stories had remained in the evidence, in the reports, in the memories of investigators, in the DNA, and eventually those pieces came together. For nearly 4 decades, the Golden State Killer had one enormous advantage: time. Time allowed evidence to become old. Time allowed investigators to retire. Time allowed witnesses' memories to fade. Time allowed the killer to believe he had escaped justice. But time also preserved something he couldn't destroy: evidence. And eventually, technology gave investigators a way to read that evidence differently. The case that once seemed impossible to solve finally had an answer. The masked stranger had a name. The predator who terrified California had finally been identified. And the man who spent decades believing the past was behind him discovered something he had underestimated. The past doesn't always stay buried. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it leaves a trace. And sometimes, after 40 years of silence, that trace leads investigators straight to your door. The Golden State Killer case is a reminder that even the coldest cases can still have a heartbeat. Because somewhere inside every forgotten file, every piece of evidence, and every unanswered question, there may still be a truth waiting to be uncovered. If you want more gripping true crime documentaries, unsolved mysteries, and investigations where the truth is often stranger than fiction, subscribe to Midnight Case Files and turn on notifications. Because the next case we uncover might be one you've never heard before. Until next time, stay curious, stay alert, and remember, sometimes the truth is clearer than fiction.